All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Ladies at UX event. My name is Lara Cabeza, and I'm a design manager at Notarize.
Hi, everyone. I am Olga Perfilieva, and I'm a senior product designer at BotKeeper, and I'm based out of Boston.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie, and I'm a senior UX engineer at Car Gurus.
And the three of us co-organized the Boston chapter of Ladies at UX. So for those of you that have joined us before, welcome back. And for those of you who are new, Ladies at UX is a global organization with the mission of celebrating and empowering women in the field of UX and design. We hold monthly meetups with all women speakers, with topics ranging from design to research and even things like UX engineering, as you'll hear about today. Before we dive in, we just want to emphasize our code of conduct. So at a high level, our community is dedicated to providing a safe experience for everyone, and we don't tolerate anything that makes anyone feel unsafe at our events or in our community. So please go to this link for more details. And if at all during this event you need to report anything, you can reach out to the co-hosts through the Zoom chat. Gonna pass it to Olga now.
Thank you, Lara. Yeah, just a quick announcement. Our upcoming event is going to be in May. Details to be announced soon, but it's going to be in collaboration with Women Talk Design and also with students of UXD. We're very excited about it. Stay tuned for the updates on that. And then also would like to mention that the chat is yours. So we don't have a physical floor here. If you are hiring or looking for a job, please feel free to share in the chat. And also, if you'd like to make an introduction, hopefully do a little bit of networking, feel free to do that. And I'm going to pass it on to Katie now.
Thanks, Olga. So if you're familiar with our events, you know we have a monthly newsletter, but if you're new, feel free to sign up. I think we'll go ahead and post the link in the chat after we wrap up this introduction. We share a lot of job postings, now some remote job postings, which is exciting, and we'll definitely have more info about our upcoming event that Olga just mentioned. So make sure you sign up there. We also just want to explain how the Q&A is going to go tonight. So feel free to ask questions throughout the talk or save them for the end. I will be kind of monitoring the chat, and if anyone has any questions, I will pull them out, and then at the end I'll be asking them to Kelly. So either ask them during the chat or keep them in a note to yourself and save them for the end. And I am especially excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Kelly, as a fellow UX engineer. Kelly is a senior UX engineer at Intuit, and she specializes in crafting large-scale design system solutions. So tonight she'll be telling us all about the field of UX engineering. So I'm going to hand it off to Kelly, and you can go ahead and share your screen.
Thanks, Katie, for that intro. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for attending my talk on UX engineering. I am thrilled to talk about what this exciting field is all about. And before we dive in, I'm sure you've noticed that my hair in my profile pic is a different color. And a fun fact, when I first dyed my hair this color, the first thing my coworkers asked me was if my hair was brand compliant. And if that isn't dedication to design systems, I don't know what is. So a little bit about me. As Katie mentioned, I am a senior UX engineer working on the Intuit design system. And I've been at Intuit for about 2.5 years. And I actually started as a product designer and transitioned to this role about a year into working at the company. And currently, I lead the effort around our design data management system, which is honestly a fancy way to say I create our design tokens. And I also help consolidate our components across our organization to create more cohesive experiences across our products. And even though I've been in the design system space for a while, I wanted to share a little bit about my background. I actually started out wanting to work in the video game industry without really knowing too much about it. My logic was that since I spent so much time, an embarrassing amount of time playing video games, how cool would it be to be able to make video games for other people to enjoy? So this direction led me to enroll in a few computer science courses in college without really knowing a single thing about what computer science really was. I was just so excited about being on this path. Plus, how hard could it be? It was pretty challenging. And after struggling for a few semesters, I felt like a total failure. I didn't know what I was doing. And I'm pretty sure I'm still haunted from the time I had to learn what recursion was. And I still cringe every time someone explains it back to me, because it's just one of those things that has stuck with me for so long. And, all of these memories kind of made me think at the time that maybe programming isn't for me. Just because I had such a hard time learning these concepts, I thought I would never be able to create anything using code, just because I couldn't grasp these concepts, and I was taking a lot longer to learn these things than the other students in the courses. And so eventually, after many moons, I ended up focusing primarily on visual design, product design, UX, the more artistic side of things. And however, there came a time in my career when I discovered that in addition to creating designs, I would also need to code my designs as well. So, alarm bells going off. I'm going, oh no, I did terrible in school with programming. What if I can't actually just code my designs? And well, I began investing time into learning what I call the professional side of front-end development, beyond the whole, just displaying hello world on a page and making it purple, like making real product level experiences. And it was such a relief when I realized I didn't actually need to know all the things that I had learned in my computer science class or didn't learn in those courses to build essentially static websites. I could just rely on HTML and CSS, which was great because I was just really worried, and that kind of made me go, okay, I can do this. I can learn HTML and CSS. And the reason that I focused so heavily on these two things was I was terrified of JavaScript. I didn't want to touch it. If I could just have someone else handle the JavaScript, I was more than happy to let specialists in that field take that on, because it terrified me. And so, using HTML and CSS, I mean, who didn't love customizing their MySpace page? And I don't know if this dates me, but I just remember having so much fun learning just, a few code snippets here and there and seeing what it changed. And it kind of just opened up a whole new world and career path for me that I hadn't considered in the past. But, all that kind of changed when I learned about React. And so when I learned what React was, I felt very uncomfortable. I said, you want me to put my HTML and JavaScript what now? And it turns out when you have to do that, it changes you. And what I like to say that React really, it made me more comfortable. Just before I'd shut the door on JavaScript. Well, now I was like, well, if I have to work in it at all, maybe we see what's changed in the past few years, and maybe it's not so bad. And I kind of went through a cycle of let's code a little bit, and then maybe I'll focus on design, code, and it basically let me explore a bunch of different tools that I may have not even known about if I wasn't curious about what was going on in the industry. And I was just so fortunate that my path allowed me to focus on both of them. And so I was able to keep up with what was happening in the industry. And eventually, this back and forth led me into the wonderful world of design systems, which I have found has been the perfect space where I could combine my skill sets and really embrace the UX engineering role. And so now the question is, but why? Why do design system teams need a UX engineer? And that's a great question, because we're fortunate now that UX design has become more popular over the years. But a UX engineer, what is that? Well, the nice thing is we can use fun analogies to help explain what our role is really solving for. So, who doesn't love food? Let's bring in a food analogy. So let's say a few parents are organizing a bake sale and they've asked you to supply some baked goods for their event. You decide to design some super cute rubber duck themed cupcakes. I mean, seriously, look how cute these are. And the design's all done, you love it, and now you just have to send it over to a bakery for them to produce it. No problem, right? So the cupcakes arrive, you're all excited, you're ready to help the parents out with their bake sale, and oops, that is and you're frustrated. You're saying, well, what happened, bakery? And the bakery says, oh, we're so sorry, we don't specialize in fancy styled cupcakes. And you're going, well, this doesn't help me. The parents are furious, the kids are starving. What are we gonna do? So let's rewind the clock a little bit and go back to our nice little crisp, clean design, our concept, our little cute little rubber duck cupcakes. And now, instead of just sending it over to the bakery, what if we talk to a fancy cupcake specialist? And that fancy cupcake specialist is all about talking back and forth, making sure that everyone's on the same page. They're asking questions, they're double checking that they're getting things right, and they're confirming details. They're saying, okay, you want the rubber duck to be made of this material, this flavor, and it's a collaborative process. And even the fancy cupcake specialist even suggests something that the designer hadn't even thought about. What if we added, a special blue frosting to simulate waves and suddenly there's excitement, there's new life in this cupcake concept. So, designer's feeling really good, the cupcake specialist feeling really good. And so then the fancy cupcake specialist can just send directly the new approved cupcakes to the bakery to really make sure the logistics are handled, make sure, the cupcakes arrive on time. So the cupcakes arrive on time, and instead of what we had previously, we have, yay! We have our cupcakes, the parents are happy, the kids love them, it's a successful bake sale, and just everyone is excited. And so going back to, the different players in this analogy, we have the bakery, the fancy cupcake specialist, the parents, the kids, and the cupcakes. So what does this all have to do with design systems and the people that work on them? Well, they kind of translate into, you have your traditional software engineers who, make sure that everything's working together as needed and kind of forming the basis and the foundation of the infrastructure. But then you're introducing this fancy cupcake specialists, the UX engineers who are specialized in a very specific part of engineering to help designers have their vision turned into a reality. And then these cupcakes are given to the parents, our product designers and developers, who then give the cupcakes to the kids or the customers. And then ultimately, the cupcakes are really your components, and who doesn't want a delicious component these days? And a common question I hear is, are you a designer who codes, or are you a developer who designs? And honestly, it depends on your background. I have seen engineers who took an interest in design and decided to change and focus on design. I know designers who wanted to learn how to code. And honestly, it's so great to have that type of diversity when we're trying to solve problems. The potential downside of this situation is sometimes you feel like you don't really belong on either side. And really, that's because people aren't really sure where you fit into their process. And to solve this, it really helps to show folks where their gaps are and the opportunities of how we fix them. In this diagram, you'll notice a lot of one-way arrows and this type of handoff style of delivery for how information and artifacts trickle their way down to end customers. And what's really nice is with UX engineering, they can help in this field because they're working so close with both design and engineering to help generate common artifacts that work in harmony. And what's nice about this is there are UX engineers who are more focused on the design experience. And then there are UX engineers who are focused on the developer experience. And we can all work together. We're all UX engineers, but our shared knowledge and passion for delivering accuracy is what makes it so transparent. And ultimately, the team has generated parity across the design and development. And not only that, we have such strong visibility into what we're delivering at the end of the day, so that we don't have to ask questions on, is what I've designed developed? Is what I've developed following design? Having that extra layer of constant communication, and I try to reflect this as circles because it is honestly an ongoing conversation between everyone involved. And the ultimate goal is providing the best experience possible for customers. Now, let's talk about what type of skills UX engineers invest in. And defining the skills can get a little tricky. After all, you're supposed to have a design engineer hybrid skill set, right? And the first one I want to highlight is attention to detail. Have you ever seen a gorgeous design and the resulting website or page just doesn't look or feel quite right? And if you aren't, used to kind of looking at designs under a microscope, it's easy to fall into the expectation of, hey, it showed up on the page. What do you want? And it's just an ongoing back and forth with fine-tuning pixels. Hey, can you move that up 2 pixels? Can you make that that section a little larger? Can we add more padding? And really having a UX engineer who's more focused on making sure that the end product really matches the details goes such a long way that I love comparing this to one of those find the differences puzzles. And I don't know if this meant that I would eventually go down this path, but I loved these kinds of puzzles as a kid. So I don't know if that training as a kid helped me become more just aware of these subtle nuances. But it is something you can practice and try and get better. And there are lots of tools that help people compare designs to what gets coded. The next skill is what I've mentioned as part of my background was the importance of HTML and CSS. And knowing best practices is so much more than just producing clean code. it has so many implications with accessibility, being able to have other developers understand what your code is doing is also huge, because we don't want to have a very siloed understanding of how something works. And honestly, like going back to code you wrote, 5 days ago, it's one of those moments where, I write that? Who would write this? And it turns out it was you. And you're like, oh, oops. And so knowing the best practices that, they do change. Like one moment you're using a certain technique, and then the next week it's like, oh, you're using that technique. Don't you know about this new way of writing CSS? And so it's just so important to have a pulse on what the latest trends are, so that when it comes down to updating your product, you're able to adapt with the rest of the modern applications that you're potentially competing with. And sure, this is kind of funny on a mug, but it's not so funny when it's in your product. So that's why it's important to just keep up with those trends and make sure that this hopefully doesn't happen to you. The next skill that I find is more of a soft skill is what I call implementation alignment. And it's really about convincing people to change their mind, which is really hard because it takes both courage and integrity to speak up when you see something that could be wrong. And what this kind of looks like is it could be a design that does not conform with the system, and saying, hey, I noticed you're using this design pattern, it doesn't really fall into our guidance of the system, and being able to feel confident enough and to discuss what they could do to modify their design to adhere to the system. Or maybe it's a code component and their implementation is not quite what you had imagined for the component usage. And just talking to them and discussing the pros and cons and being able to show them, hey, if you change the way that you're implementing it, it's a lot cleaner and it'll just perform a lot more reliably. And it's just having the courage to bring these things up. And it's one of the things that we constantly work towards. I know I do on a daily basis. And so what I usually find is just trying to identify what's consistent and really determine what is the outlier. And hopefully a visual like this from a code and component perspective, this makes it a lot easier to convince people that they should adapt to your suggestion. And knowing and because everything in a system is connected, it's so important to understand the impact of making changes, because you change one thing and then suddenly everything could explode. And this is typically how I look after one of these conversations, because I'm trying to map out what everything is touching. And I'm saying, oh, well, if you change the radius of that component, it's going to change the radius for all the components, and everyone's going, wow, like, all right, let's do something else. And so it's just one of those fun conversations to have, to kind of test the limits of the system and really understand what the impact is for these design decisions. And the last skill I want to touch on is user empathy, because ultimately our job on the design systems team is to make the lives of our product designers and developers easier. And if they're not happy, we really need to listen and learn. And even if our implementation, we consider, oh, that's best practice. If no one else agrees, then is best practice really the best practice? And it's more about understanding where our users are and where they're coming from. Because negative feedback is always better when it's direct than when it's done in private. So now I'm going to jump into some real examples because now that we know what UX engineers excel at, we can now see real ways that we can apply them in real scenarios. And the first example I'll go over is what it's like to audit. One of the main responsibilities of being a UX engineer is to ensure that design and code tell the same story. And we do this through auditing what exists in both design and code, and we also help identify a plan to address any differences. Now, when you look at the differences between design and code, it's easy to just say, hey, that's not right. It should look like this. But there's more to the story. We really want to examine why this disconnect happened in the first place and work on a solution that addresses these problems. Because it's not so much that the border radius is off a little bit, the color's wrong, the alignment isn't great. Those are all bigger symptoms of an underlying issue between the fact that maybe the design assets were not using the right styles, or maybe it was a wrong design token implementation. So when we figure out the root cause, it's a lot easier to avoid these types of disconnects in the future instead of having to pinpoint these little nuances for each component. And I also wanted to highlight accessibility, because when accessibility gets brought up, I have found that the usual focus is it starts off as a color contrast conversation because it's the easiest one to audit with design tools. But there's so much more to consider. In this example, users can visually see a label that a payment was successful, but that label is not directly next to the icon, which for people who can see the screen, they can kind of see that relationship just being able to look at the page. But for screen readers, they are unable to see that visual connection. And so some of the things that our team does is to understand what is the intent, the design intent of what is the association between the icon and the text, and then come up with a coded way to connect the two. So in this example, if we were to use something like ARIA described by and point it to the section that talks about that the payment was successful, when users are using screen readers, they'll hear payment was successful when they have focused on the icon. And these small little details create such a more rich experience for now we have addressed both the needs of our users who can see the screen and the users who are using screen readers. And just making experiences accessible is a big part of how we look at components and what we're offering to our users today, and making sure that everyone can experience what we're offering. Another accessibility one that I like to look at is reduced motion. And one of the things that I really like to learn and study is how can we make sure that even if we have this really fancy, intense animation, what are our other users who have reduced motion experiencing? And really, there's so many creative ways to approach this. And I love that more people are starting to get involved in these types of conversations, because it's not just about, oh, they don't need any animation, just turn it off. There's a lot more that we can do for those users to make sure that they still experience personality and without having a bad experience as well. And when we've talked so much about, the design and code being different, making sure that they look the same. And, sometimes design and code, they do look the same, but we find out during our auditing process that the underlying logic of the code doesn't really capture the design intent. And this is a little misleading because you think, oh, it looks the same. Like, of course it's gonna behave exactly what the specs entail? And it turns out it doesn't. And we actually go in and we compare the different defaults. We look at what's required. We look at the different options that the components are offering to make sure they align with the different options in the spec. And we work to make sure that those things are as they would expect, because at the end of the day, it's so nice to be able to ask a designer, hey, what different sizes do you offer for this component? And a designer could say small, medium, large. And small, medium, large maps to something in code where that terminology is the same. So a designer can say, hey, use the small variant, and a developer will understand what that means. And lastly, performance. We see quite a few components that pull in these large libraries. And sometimes they're needed, but sometimes they're not. And so we kind of look to see what libraries and dependencies are being pulled in, and look at opportunities to make things a little bit less heavy and improve performance. And all this work, honestly, sometimes feels like I'm a detective, and it's fun, but it's also challenging. It's challenging and rewarding. The next topic or example I wanted to go through is about design data. UX engineers spend a lot of time understanding both the internal and external relationships about what goes into our system. In order to have teams consider system-wide impact, we need to ensure that everyone, again, is speaking the same language. And that means that when we refer to a certain part of a component, there isn't confusion with what we're referencing. And in this example, I have little labels pointing to different parts of a component. And so if I said, hey, could you tell me a little bit more about the text in this component? It's very clear to know what I'm talking about. But let's say I was using a different term. You might get confused with, for example, if there's an icon on the left and the close icon was also called icon, it could get really confusing when I'm like, yeah, the icon in that component, and people will be like, well, which icon? And so we have a lot of conversations about what do we name this thing, and sometimes it's methodical, and we have research, and we compare what other teams have called their elements of their components. And sometimes I honestly feel like a rock, paper, scissors contest could resolve it a lot faster. So the concept, this concept expands out to related components and helping teams adjust to align so there isn't confusion. In this example, we have checkboxes, and they're using the term checked. But for radio buttons, that state's called selected. And, you know, it makes sense in the context if you look at it in isolation, like a checkbox checked, like, okay, and a radio button selected also makes sense. But there is an opportunity to use a different term that would encapsulate both options so that we don't have to store an additional term within our list of states that we supply for a given component. And by consolidating this terminology, it allows us to not have to do any of this mental modeling mapping in our heads, because we don't have to say, okay, it's checked for that component, it's selected here, it's pressed here, and we can kind of start working together on a more singular language to describe these relationships. And the last part of all of this design data mapping, which is, I find, the most challenging part, is really understanding the breakdown of what each part of the data is telling you. And in this example, I'm looking at a raw pixel value. A designer has supplied 5 pixels. And 5 pixels in our system is not an actual value that we support. We support increments of 4. So it's one of those opportunities where we say, hey, I noticed you're using 5 pixels. What if we change that to 4? And kind of walk them through it. But the conversation doesn't end there. It's not just that we're changing it to 4. We're changing it to 4 because it's mapped to a primitive design token in our system. And this connection is super important because what this is doing is it's mapping what could just be an outlier, and it makes it brought back into the system. And so we could just stop at size 1. We could just say, okay, this old value is now 4 pixels, and now it's tied to size 1. Everyone's happy, cool. But we don't want to just stop there because we want to have a better description of why we're applying size 1 to this thing. So what if we could apply something that describes that relationship a little bit better? What if we have a density, and when we use this value, it's supposed to talk about like a compact type of relationship with the component. And so now we have, instead of just a 4 pixel value that's tied to size 1, we're actually describing the relationship where we're saying, hey, this component, it's using a density compact padding, so that in the future, maybe we've changed our minds. Maybe compact isn't 4 pixels. Maybe it's a different value. We can just change the end value of that density compact token, and then any component that's using that token will get that update for free. So it's a really powerful visual redesign refresh tool. And if we take the time to map these relationships out at the start, it will make it so much simpler when we make changes in the future. And so we just talked about design data, and now we can use this new way of thinking to define how our actual component logic works. And I want to stress that just because the design spec has been approved by design, there's still a lot of conversations to happen because so many assumptions get made. And our role as UX engineers is to ask questions and to make sure that we understand exactly what the intent was. For example, in this, can any of these buttons use an icon, or is it just primary buttons? Is it always a chevron, or can users place other icons? Can the icons go on the left? Can tertiary buttons have a blue border? There's so many questions that need to be answered because just a static design artifact usually doesn't provide you the full picture of what we need in order to make a component that matches, again, design intent. There's also a balance that we need to consider with the amount of engineering constraints that we need to incorporate. And one of the things I usually ask design is, what can a user actually change? What is the expectation? Because we could have very specific logic that puts these buttons in a very specific order. Or we could rely on designers providing that guidance to other designers so that order is respected from a design point of view instead of having that type of order be forced in code. And what's interesting is a lot of different developers have different opinions on what should be flexible and what should be following a very strict set of logic. And one of the things that I've learned personally is that design changes a lot. So having more flexibility with what users can do with their components does make it easier in the future when things change, because then it's more about being able to flex and address the design versus having the coded component having to rework that logic to support the new flexibility. And the last thing I want to talk about on this topic is that when you're working with multiple different color schemes, there is an added complexity of applying different values with those configurations. And what I mean by that is, in this example, you have 3 themes, and theme 1 wants purple, theme 2 wants light blue, and theme 3 wants a dark blue for their square component. but that square component can have multiple different configurations. And for different configurations, they want different colors. And and now instead of having to map in one two-dimensional direction of theme data, you're suddenly having to supply a lot more data to accommodate these specific theme values. And that's why our team we try to see where different teams can align to reduce the number of complexity in the data, just so that, because any customization will increase the amount of data we have to store. And that is something that we're trying to improve. And ultimately, the less data we have to store, the better. And then for the most part, everything that I've shared with you has been a little hidden. But we now finally get to showcase all of our hard work. And at Intuit, we use an open source tool called Storybook. And we use Storybook to QA our work in progress, and we use it as a way to educate our broader audience to show how a component works and how it changes for each product. And it's not enough that we are just looking at a spec and throwing out examples, because what we're really trying to do is showcase how an end user would want to manipulate a component. And some of it is stuff that is something that we just expect users to do. And then other examples are things that we never thought users would try and do. And so we learn every day about what users are trying to do with these components. And then we work to showcase those examples so that other users can benefit from these questions and the need to override certain things. And throughout this process, we're constantly iterating. We are listening to feedback. We're working with other product designers. We're working with product developers. We're creating tests. It's a constant loop of feedback and iterating. Honestly, at this point, it's not surprising to feel some mild burnout, because sometimes we just want to move on to the next thing. We've been working, we've audited, we've done design data, and someone's asking if the component can handle any feature. And what I want to say here is that it takes experience and discipline to know what feedback to address and what can wait for a future release. So we're almost to the finish line. We've ensured that our component works for product developers, product designers, but now we need to make sure that our community is informed on all these updates so that they could take advantage of what's available in our design system. Because honestly, we want to avoid this scenario as much as possible. And while visuals do help, like in presenting a from to scenario, it's really about why we're doing these things. Because sometimes, we get the question, hey, did you mean for this to change? Is this a change that we wanted to have happen? And we get those questions because we don't have an explicit documentation or comms around it. So we're constantly working on how to improve communication. So we can improve that by attaching more context into these changes and explaining why. And ultimately that explaining these changes helps improve trust. In addition, a well-documented component also cuts down on the amount of questions that the team has to answer on an ad hoc basis. So a little bit of upfront time on helping users install what they need and maybe showcasing some instructions that they have to do to run the component. That saves so much time than having to answer the same things over and over again. And it just makes the context for when someone's looking at this, it brings everything together. And lastly, I want to also mention that you should be communicating early and also communicate where users are. And I've heard it before where they're like, oh, people don't read the newsletter, people don't look at the website. And what I try and advise is, okay, if they don't look at those things, let's put it someplace else. Let's have a single source of communication that can be broadcasted to these multiple channels, because everyone wants updates differently. Some people just want the high level stuff every few weeks. Some people want the information as soon as it's available. And some people want a blog article for why things are changing. And each of these different channels have different fortes for communicating that type of information. And so now, after you've communicated out your new components and the update, it's time to celebrate. Congratulations, you've released a well-documented component that matches design intent. And I want to wrap up this talk with a few helpful resources, and I will be sharing this deck out so you'll have these links available. And I hope these resources help. They are, there's some fun ones in there to just, if you're a designer and you're not really sure, what even is something that's fun for CSS, there's a few of these tools that can help you and explore and really help you break the internet, which is what I like to frame it. When learning about these things, I have found cross-discipline learning the best way to learn, because if you're a JavaScript developer and you're trying to learn CSS, like, it's helpful to, if you already know JavaScript concepts, it's helpful to have that same terminology when you're trying to learn CSS. Same thing with React for designers. There's a lot of design, it's framed for designers, so the examples are more applicable to what you already know. And so by finding resources that speak to what you already know, it does help you kind of bridge the uncomfortable level you may have when learning these new things. And the last resource slide I have is just some inspiration to kind of, if maybe you're not specialized, you don't have a bunch of visual design to fall back on to code. I love looking at daily UI examples on Dribbble. My friend Kalshuk just released Front End Practice, which is an amazing resource to look at real websites and to copy them, which is really cool. And then I just like looking at cool, like non-traditional things to code. So I like looking at menus and saying, hey, how can I code that that menu? So that could be neat. And ultimately, I hope that this talk has inspired you to learn more about UX engineering and to join our small but ever-growing community, and we'd love to have you. And wrapping up, I just want to thank Olga, Katie, and Lara for having me as a speaker, all of you who have joined in, my amazing Intuit design system team, and all the folks I get to build awesome things with. And lastly, my husband, who took care of a bunch of things so I could have time to prepare for this talk. And I also wanted to mention, we are hiring a contract UX engineering position for our team, so you get to work with me, yay. So if you're interested, please, you can reach out to me on Twitter at KellyCodesChaos if you're interested. So thank you so much, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That was amazing. Loved it. Love your talk. Okay, so now we have some time for questions. We already do have one question, so we'll just kick it off with that. And folks in the chat, if you have any, feel free to ask. I know I have quite a few questions, but we'll prioritize your questions because I'm me. Okay, so the first question is from Alexandra in the chat, and she asks, what would you highlight in a portfolio for a UX engineer?
That's a really good question. So it would depend on what your forte is. I would start with that. So if you are an engineer trying to highlight that you want to be an UX engineer, I would try and have case studies that showcase where you were in your comfort zone and what you had to do to adjust to help a designer. And if you're a designer going more into the in the engineering side of things, I would say highlight examples, do again a case study where you had to change your design based on working closer with engineers. So kind of show the growth in the other direction and what the impact is for the end result of what you're working on. And ultimately, with those case studies, I would highlight just the end result and the impact, I would say.
That's great. Someone in the chat is asking how you'll get this talk later. We're going to put this up on YouTube for everybody. So don't worry, you can access it later. I have a question for you that I don't know how I would answer. It's a little bit hard, but you mentioned like your journey with CSS and HTML and JavaScript, and so many people in the chat were like, oh my God, I feel this. I certainly feel that way. Can you describe like, what is it about HTML and CSS that just felt comfortable to you compared to JavaScript?
Yeah, well, I don't know how much this dates me, but when I started doing HTML development, I didn't know if you had to install software. I just didn't know how computers worked when I was like, how are people making websites? And I took a very intro course when I was in grade school where the teacher said, oh, just use Notepad++. I was like, wait, what? Like Notepad? Like we can write websites in Notepad? I'm confused. Because I just always thought it was some complicated thing that you had to install and you had to have a specific computer setup. And so when I learned that I could just make a file, change the file type to .html, and it just worked, it blew my mind. I was like, oh my goodness, I can make websites. And that just was such an exciting thing because up till that point, I felt intimidated by everything. And just the fact that I could just use a text editor to do something really cool, that made me feel less afraid of learning some of the more complicated parts of it.
Yep, I totally agree with you. I feel that. Okay, Rizal in the chat asks, how do you approach introducing UX engineering for the first time at a company, particularly when the engineering team doesn't necessarily see the value of it yet, or doesn't think it's important or necessary? This is super common. What do you think?
Well, as the first UX engineer at my company at Intuit, I have a lot of context for that. And what I ended up doing was I did a bunch of interviews. I interviewed a lot of product designers and developers across the company. And I would just sit with them and I would ask questions. I would say, how do you work with the design system? So, like, show me what you're doing. And I would listen and I would, be like, oh, I noticed you're not using something from our design system. Why is that? And I just had a bunch of data based on these interviews, and I consolidated that into a deck. And I called it the gaps and opportunities for our design system. And what was interesting about that was just having such a rich data set, because I'm nosy and I want to know how people are working. And I am an introvert, by the way. I'm a very it's really hard for me to reach out. So I was so passionate about this that I overcame my sense of not wanting to, talk to new people, but I just needed to know what the state of everything was. So I had that data, I had a presentation, and I kind of outlined, what we're missing and what kind of role would be great to solve this. And at the time, I didn't have a name for it. I was like, we just need a person that does this. And I had started looking at articles. I saw, design engineer, UX development, And, there's design technologists, but nothing really felt right to me. Like I didn't want design in the title because I felt like I wanted to be more than design. I wanted to encompass more of the experience. So I love that UX part. And then we have, software engineer. So I was like, oh, let's, engineer sounds good. UX engineer, like other people have that title at other companies. Like that sounds like it would go together with this too. And, I had the deck, I had the data, I had the suggestions, and I started presenting it to different people in our org. And I started off small with my own team. And then I would take notes from what they said. I would redo the presentation a little bit, and I would present at a larger audience. And then finally I had like this really robust deck that had been blessed by certain leaders at the company, and it just made it a lot easier because it wasn't just me. Like I wanted to make it clear, it wasn't just me. I was just bringing up the voice of the community. And that's the most important thing, is it's not just about you pushing something, it's you are just helping other people raise their voice up. So that was like the biggest lesson I can offer to, if you're trying to convince people of things, is try to leave yourself out of it, and also try and get as much data as possible. And shout out to Adam Dierkins, who's on this call, and I see you, who supplied some of those initial screenshots that helped made its way into that presentation.
I love how you called it an opportunity instead of just calling it tech debt, because tech debt really scares people, especially engineering leaders, and they just don't want to put resources towards it. But calling it an opportunity and filling the gaps, I think, is excellent. All right. Kara has a great question. Interested to hear your thoughts on this. What are your thoughts on the inspect capabilities in modern design tools like Figma and Envision? Do you use this? Do you recommend it? Is it helpful? Is it harmful? What do you think?
We are actually working to improve that functionality from a plugin standpoint. One of the biggest things that we've noticed is that those inspect tools just currently return your raw values, so 4 pixels, 8. It's very tied to the raw values that a developer sees, and we are moving in a direction where instead of plugging in those raw values, we're plugging in design tokens, and I think there is huge potential for. And we use Figma, by the way. So we're working on creating Figma plugins, and we're seeing what kinds of things that are on the Figma roadmap as well, to see what we can do to make sure that whatever we're working through can work with what they have planned as well. And so with the inspect tool, what we do use it more currently as like a QA thing, like is this returning the actual hex that we expected it to? But I have found that we rely so much on code as a source of truth these days that if something's wrong in a Figma file, it's okay. Like we can update it later. If something's wrong in your coded component, that's a whoa, like let's take care of that yesterday type of reaction.
Yep. I'm there with you. It's really cool that you're building plugins for it. I'm excited to hear more about that, maybe in a future article. All right, next question. This is an interesting one. So a component design can be aesthetically pleasing, but devastating for accessibility on the web, which you definitely talked about a bit tonight. What are some ways that you convince design to make those changes to like improve that experience?
Yeah, so one of the things we did was we actually brought our accessibility team, the Intuit accessibility team, under our design system team. And what that did was it really helped us be more close to hearing the voice of the customer and accessibility needs, and being able to address it at the atomic design system level before it made its way to product design and developers. And so Ted Drake, who heads up our accessibility team, he is so passionate about accessibility. I love it. And what I love about Ted's approach is he doesn't want to be the only accessibility guy. That's not his dream is that everyone is an accessibility champion. So at Intuit, we're accessibility champions when we've completed certain levels of, we call them like accessibility champion criteria. And honestly, the way that, and everyone is different. Everyone has different motivations and ways of learning. And I've always found gamification, well, I'm a gamer, so that appealed to me. So I have found that if people feel competitive, that's a great motivator to be more passionate. So there are certain tools that I love to talk about. I love Lighthouse as a tool to just a quick audit. I know X tools. There are certain tools that I love to use, that I love to just show people, hey, my site's this good. What do you got? And really challenging them, because maybe some people, they just don't know. They have no idea that what they're offering is not accessible. But when you give them an actual, like, here, put your website into this tool, let's see what you got. It really, I've seen people go, oh, I'm ashamed. And I see a lot of growth from just that, seeing a number in red and going, I did that, and seeing how that sparks motivation.
I love that. It's almost like you're taking away, I don't know, it becomes less, you're using tools to your advantage to have like sometimes really difficult conversations. I really like that. I'm going to definitely use that myself. Someone wants to know if you could talk a little bit more about what kind of internal tools that you build or use, like as far as Figma and Sketch plugins go.
Yeah, so not our team specifically yet, and I say yet because we're always growing and innovating, but one of the Figma plugins that I wanted to highlight that I recently saw a demo of that was really cool is, unfortunately it's internal for now, but our design technologist group has made a really cool plugin that is all about, it's actually does multiple things, but yeah, I can probably talk a little bit about what they do. So one of them, it will change your artboards, or not artboards, frames, sorry, in Figma, to be light mode or dark mode, which is pretty cool. So they see that instant change is really powerful, and I love that. They also worked on one where we're pulling in data into a Figma file, so you don't have to do your, I hate lorem ipsum. It's one of my pet peeves. If you show me a design as lorem ipsum, I'll be like, rejected. Give me like, fake data that'll be what an end user probably will use and see. And so they've worked with our content team to be able to supply that kind of information, which is super nice, because then you're not working with, you're working with real potential data, not real, but like the types of data that you would see. So our design technologist group at Intuit is amazing. They create a lot, they have made a lot of cool tools. Our team has been more geared towards dev related tooling. So we've done some really cool things around automation is a big one. And when I say our team, we work with a lot of different teams. So I like to have like it's a family team across different orgs. But some of my favorite tools that we've done has been Auto, which I think I talk about almost on a daily basis because I use it so often. But it's been one of the biggest improvements of working in a design system, just from being able to automate Slack announcements from releases. And I love that tool. And then our design system CLI tool has been great about spinning up component repos that use a consistent infrastructure. So you get a bunch of like freebies, you get Storybook, you get testing, you get a bunch of things. And Auto and DSCLI are both open source. So anyone can use those. And I feel like I'm a spokesperson for those two plugins, but if you read any articles from me, I think I probably mentioned them in the past few articles I published.
That all sounds very exciting. Automation is really interesting, especially in the Figma space. Like I feel like some of the work that's going into Figma, it really is kind of bridging that code gap. Like you kind of experience some of the magic of code a little bit more in Figma, and it's fun to work with designers experiencing that for the first time. Kathleen, hello Kathleen, asks, what are your thoughts on TypeScript versus JS and JSX with prop types? Do you have any opinions there?
I love TypeScript. So let's just, when I first found out what TypeScript was, I went, oh my goodness, this solves so many problems. Because instead of having a user find the problem, we could find it first. And that was so interesting to me that I will always, talk about the benefits of it. When we talk about prop types, I have found that it goes back to design intent, and it goes back to flexibility. And sometimes when I'm talking to design and I see something and I ask, can anything go in here? Like, what kind of prop type should we support? Like, do we need to attach prop types to children, essentially? Those are some of the questions I ask. And I'm still learning. Like I still, every component, I feel like I still have these conversations. Like I want to understand, because I feel every component's different, and the use case can be different. And again, it goes back to, do we over engineer, or do we let design guidance drive what limitations we put in it? So I'm willing to like go with the flow of like not specifying as many strict prop types if I can, but that's just my personal preference, and I'm sure everyone has their own opinion on how strict to make these types of decisions.
You think engineers have opinions on TypeScript and strictness?
Don't get me started on mono repos, because that's a whole we can have a whole talk about mono repos too.
Yep, I work in one, I know. Okay, I think this is going to be our last question for tonight from Kim. So Kim asks, what kind of experience or thoughts do you have using design systems and components in an agency environment versus brand and product design? And what advice do you have for making that shift or having designers work more closely with engineering?
I actually I worked in both product and agency. And I think, honestly, the agency stuff was a little easier because you had more, at least in my experience, had more control over what we exposed to the end user. So we, at a previous company, I did a lot of white labeling, and we would flag certain attributes to be themable. And if a client wanted to customize more than that, we charged for it. So I was like, oh, we have to do more work. Okay, like that's fine. Yeah, you theme whatever you want. Like that works. Because there was a cost associated. And it's funny that when you bring up cost, a lot of companies are like, oh no, like the default font, that's fine. Like we don't have to change that. Like that works for us. And so just have that very clear definition of, these are the things that we expect and come with our package. You can change. Want to change more, there's a cost associated to it. And what's different about that versus working when it's all just product and there isn't really that client definition is it's a lot harder. It's a lot hazier. Because you're not like, it's a hazier definition because we're all we're all internal. There's no client. So we're all one team. And so I have found that as we mature as a design system, we are trying to get to a place that is like the the agency methodology, where you have those very distinct things that will change. And so we're getting there, but it's a very different type of discussion to have than an agency. So I would say that's the biggest change that I've experienced. And to as far as working with engineering on either side, they've actually been pretty similar. I haven't noticed like too much difference from an engineering standpoint of how those things relate back. It was really the design side of negotiations that I felt was a very different way of getting to a solution for those situations.
Great. I love that. Thanks so much, Kelly, for your time, for the amazing talk tonight, and for sticking around for some questions from our audience. It was great. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. We hope to see you at our next event next month.
Thanks,
All
everyone.
right. Thanks.